Hello everyone, I'm Ryan.
I'm Charles.
As you may have guessed from the title, we're covering industrials and basic materials. And we're going to start with industrials and end up in materials. So looking at industrials in the S&P 500 index, they're this pink slice here, and they represent a fairly large portion, but they're not the biggest. Like it's very dominated by IT. We have in our holdings about 8.4%, so we're a little underweight. The S&P is 9.6, but that's okay. As far as performance goes, industrials have been doing really well. It's hard to differentiate these lines because they're so close together. The light blue one is the S&P 500, and it returned over the past 5 years 73.56%. And industrials are just right behind that. They're one of the better sectors in the index. I think some of the growth was really dominated by IT over that time, and it tends to drag up the whole index as a result. It's comprised of a wide variety of industries. They're like real tangible companies, I think, that most people can wrap their heads around. Airlines, road and rail, electrical equipment, building products. There's nothing like too complicated there, I think. Like some of like the ones in IT are, like, I don't really understand, I guess.
Some of the more information-focused companies, they'll talk about blockchain, and I went to a blockchain presentation this past summer. They will start talking over your head very rapidly. Very smart computer stuff is what I got out of most of it. We're not going to talk about them today, though. So,
yeah, these are all really straightforward companies that I think everybody can understand. We have holdings primarily in the aerospace and defense industry. Actually, we have two government, like major government contractors that operate extensively in that sector. We also have Alaska Airlines, and then Kimball, which is the furniture company that's come up a couple times. They're in the commercial services and supplies sector. Did I get that right, Peter?
What?
Oh,
Yeah, it is.
Making faces back there.
No.
we didn't do a 5 forces for them.
Yeah, we're I guess kind of going out of order. I wanted to start with our holdings just to give a rationale for why we're looking at the industries we're looking at. Like I mentioned, we have Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, which are two major defense contractors. I think Lockheed's actually the biggest out of all of them. I think Raytheon, Boeing, and then these two are like the big four, if you will. And then Alaska Air and Kimball. There's a bunch of information on there that's on your handout if you want to.
This is blurry. It's the same thing you guys have.
That's a terrible slide, but we figured we'd just go over it just to touch on why we're looking at the industries. So starting with aerospace and defense, we figured we'd look at that one since it's the biggest in that sector. The threat of new entrants, we put it low because like I don't know how you get into the aerospace and defense industry. You have to have very smart people working for you and a lot of money to spend on it, developing new technology.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to get into. Power of suppliers for that, they don't really have any power for that. There's only a few corporations that they're buying from.
I think they kind of are the suppliers in the value chain. They're sourcing commodities and turning them into weapons, basically, and other technologies for the use by the government. And the power of buyers is extremely high because they're primarily selling to the U.S. government and their allies. Like that's it really. There are a couple others, but they don't have the influence like the Department of Defense does.
The U.S. government also gets to set who, since these are American companies that we have, the U.S. government gets to set who they get to sell to. So Northrop Grumman can't walk up to Russia, China, Saudi Arabia and say, we want to sell you F-22s. The government can say, you're not going to do that without our okay. So.
But Charles, so you're a vet, right?
Yes.
So you may have had the government purchasing process or the military purchasing process, kind of at least some tangential experience with it. How does the government go about purchasing things, whether it's weapons, anything you had experience with?
I didn't really have a whole lot to deal with that, but the government, generally if they want to buy something, they'll put out a bid. They'll say, we want to buy a helicopter. So they replaced the helicopter that I worked on shortly after I got out. They said, we want to replace the Kiowa. And they'll put out a bid, and they say it must be able to do these things. You know, it's got to fly 200 miles an hour, it's got to climb, this many feet in a minute, it's got to carry 12 people, it's got to be able to have 5 hard points, right? Okay, and it's got to be able to resist, this many bullet hits before it falls apart. You're like, okay. And so, you know, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, McDonnell Douglas, all the airline companies that make things are gonna make helicopters that do that. They're gonna run through about 5-6 years of tests, they're gonna perform trials, they're gonna fly their models out there and they're gonna get shot at, essentially. And they're gonna run them through all the tests, they're gonna say, how fast did it fly, how far did it fly, how many people did we cram in there, how much could we sling load under it. And they're gonna do those tests for about 5 years. And then the government's gonna go, all right, which one did we like best? And they're gonna take feedback from the test pilots, feedback from the people who rode in them, feedback from the people that run the flight schools, and they're gonna see which one can we cram into a C-130, which one, how many can we fit into a C-5, which one's cheapest, and how many can you deliver us in a 10-year period? And put all that together into a matrix.
So does the government expect all those companies to just do all that R&D and come up with products that meet their specs without any help from the government?
No, they pay
Right.
them for that.
Yeah, so.
But not, they don't fully fund it, but they do. I don't know how much that the government pays for the R&D. I think it's probably about 30 or 40%. But some of that is definitely covered by the government for being in the bidding process.
I think it certainly depends on what kind of product category
Yeah.
you're talking about, but my point here is procurement through the Department of Defense doesn't work like procurement in the private sector.
Right.
So if you're a military contractor, yes, sure, you're selling to primarily one buyer, but that one buyer is going to give you a very long-term stable contract and probably fund a lot of the product development as
Right.
well, right? So there's some perks to working with one buyer.
Right.
Okay, sorry, keep going, guys.
Yeah. And like you said, you also must tailor your product, so you can't just make an item. So Ford makes a car, you decide, I don't like the Mustang. Ford's like, okay, go buy a Chevy. Lockheed Martin says, we made the F-22. They made it exactly the way the Air Force wanted it. They did not just say, hey, we made a jet fighter. There was a very extensive decade-long process that went into that. Threat substitutes is low. Nobody else is making a smart bomb. There's just, you can't really substitute that for anything else. They are highly unique and no substitutes exist. The existing rivalry is, we said it's high because they're competing aggressively for the same contract. So an Air Force contract for a refueler came up about 6 years ago. That contract is not going to come up again to design a new KC-135 for about 20 years. These things, the B-52s are still in existence. They were built in 1952. They're going to be in existence for another 20 years. So these contracts are extremely long-lived. Boeing has made billions and billions of dollars off of that. So if you get one of these contracts, you make lots and lots of money.
Yeah, one of our companies, Lockheed, actually just lost two fairly good-sized contracts to Boeing, like on this process. In a rivalry, like competing for the same ones. A helicopter one, I forget what the other one was. It was much smaller.
Yeah, but it's like the soda industry we talked about. So there is, you know, until something new happens, there is some competition, but when that new thing happens, everybody's on it. So.
As far as risk factors go, kind of like we talked about, sales concentration with the DoD. She was talking about the revenue or R&D reimbursements, so that helps with that, but it is still like you have to get it right. And then that tends to vary a bit with like political cycles and how willing the country is to spend on new defense development and things of that nature. I guess, and another thing, she was talking about the procurement process. There's a lot of strings attached with federal money and complying with all the specific contract provisions and getting it right. If you don't comply to like a material extent, there are negative repercussions, and you can lose contracts and have to like pay damages and things. So that's a major thing. In addition, these companies have a lot of subcontractors working for them on the projects. Like Lockheed will be awarded the contract, but then they'll farm out some of the work, like to Northrop Grumman and other things like that. And they're not like overseeing the day-to-day operations of those subcontractors. And so if some of those guys do something that they shouldn't, like Lockheed's still liable for it to some extent because it's their contract and they're overseeing it. We touched on the bid process, it's really competitive, like that's a big thing. If you're not getting bids, you're not, like, you end up getting set up for a long time if you win one of these government contracts, and so missing out on it is a bad thing.
And then cybersecurity, if, you know, we've all heard about the Russian hackers. If they hack Northrop Grumman, if they hack, you know, any of these major companies, you're gonna be hurt, because you're not gonna get those bids, you're not gonna be trusted. If you don't get trusted, you don't get bids, you don't get bids, you don't make money, you go down the tubes real quick. So, you know, they invest heavily in that, and they have really strong IT departments. Also, because a lot of their things that they make rely heavily on computers. You can't fly a plane without being very knowledgeable about computers.
You wanna walk us through airlines?
Sure. Talking about airplanes still.
Switching industries though.
Yeah, this one, less guns on these airplanes, mostly. The entrance is very low, because it costs a lot to start an airline. You can't just go out and start one, much like when Nicole talked about the grocery stores. It costs a lot to start and stop an airline. But the more your airline expands, it becomes cheaper to operate. So the economies of scale come in there. Power of suppliers is very high, so most airlines buy parts from a few places. There's only, you know, maybe 3 or 4 different companies that actually sell parts that it looks like they come from lots of places, but that's because they own places. They're like octopi. The place at the top owns lots of them, and it looks like you're actually just buying from one big company. So the power of suppliers is actually pretty high. China is actually starting to buy engine makers for smaller planes. Yeah, and so you can pretty much, if you want to buy planes, you can pretty much buy from Boeing, or you can buy from Airbus. That's about it. You can't really buy a 787 from anybody else. Like Cessna's not going to make anything for Alaska Airlines, for example. The power of buyers is medium high. Alaska Airlines, you know, American, Delta, that's maybe Southwest. That's about it. Internationally, you've got, you know, Lufthansa, British Airways, Air France, Alitalia, lots more. Air China.
Wait, so you're describing those airlines as buyers? I'm a little
Buyers of
confused.
airlines. So the power of buyers is more.
We're looking at transportation.
Right.
Yeah.
So the people that are going to buy them are more. So Alaska Air operates in a lot of those places, so they fly to Europe, for example. Like, so you can.
So who's the buyer? And wait, I'm confused.
Okay, so the people here, like us, we would be the buyers.
Okay,
We have fewer buyers for Alaska Airlines in the U.S. market. They don't operate all across the country. If I'm in Florida, I can't get an Alaska Airlines ticket.
they do fly to Florida. I've flown
Oh,
Alaska.
do you? I didn't know that.
Understood, okay.
But more internationally. So if I'm in Germany, I can get an Alaska Airlines ticket to come to Fairbanks. I've actually known people that did that. If I'm in Japan, if I'm in China, I can get an Alaska Airlines ticket. But if I'm in Kansas, I probably can't.
We'll probably move on from this one, but
Okay.
within the geographic markets that Alaska Airlines serves, and I don't, they have code-shares, but they don't fly directly to anywhere in Europe. To the best of my knowledge, they're strictly North America and Caribbean.
Okay.
They connect
What?
partnerships.
Yeah, they're code shares, but they don't actually fly
Okay.
there. But the idea, I think, to classify their buyers, just think about the geographic markets they serve and who are the people that are buying those tickets there. So, us, right, okay.
The threat of substitutes is fairly low. That's really the fastest place you want to get somewhere is the airline. You can't take a train out of Alaska, really. You can drive, but that's going to take you a couple weeks. And the existing rivalries are pretty low. It's kind of like what we talked about with the defense industry. There's a few players, but they kind of have set the same price. If you go search for a ticket to Seattle, they're all about the same price.
Sure, yeah, as far as risk factors go to an airline's ability to conduct business, like having a bad reputation, kind of like Peter and I were talking about United earlier today, like they took a major hit last year because they had some real bad PR, not for accidents, but for reputation. Like you don't really want to fly on an airline that you feel like is unsafe or is going to treat you poorly or anything like that. So that's a major risk factor to the business. Another one is government regulation. They're like airlines, I believe, are the most regulated industry in the United States. There's a tremendous amount of federal code dedicated solely to airlines. But so that's major. Like if things change, they have no control over that really. Like they can lobby or whatever, but they're not directly responsible for that. In addition, fuel price fluctuations are a major thing. That's one of their largest inputs, and so like that's pretty important. Most companies have some way to help mitigate that risk. Like they'll have futures contracts on fuel, or like Delta owns their own refinery, I believe, to help control for fuel price fluctuations. But it's still a major factor in the business, and it directly translates to their operating margins. Yes. In addition, just people's willingness to travel and go places and spend money on airline tickets. If they're not making a lot of money personally, they're not going to be able to go take big vacations to like Hawaii or places that these companies fly. Also, like Charles said, supplier influence. There's a couple engine manufacturers. There's a couple airplane manufacturers, and that's really it. They have a lot of power over the industry as a whole. So, moving on from those two industries to specific metrics to look at them, airlines, there are a lot of really commonly available ones. Available seat miles, which is just like how far they can fly and how many seats they have in their airplanes, like what their capacity is basically. Revenue passenger miles, revenue per available seat mile, air traffic liability, load factor. Load factor is just like how much of their fleet is being successfully deployed and engaged in business, I guess. Air traffic liability is like their essentially unearned revenue, like how many people have booked flights and that they haven't flown. As far as aerospace and defense goes, there weren't a ton that were commonly available, but backlog is kind of like what we were talking about with those the contracts. They're really long, and so it's looking at how much of that contract is left, basically, like what work a company has left to do and how stable their revenue is going to be for the years to come. It's a big thing looking at the industry. It's like if a contract has been really good for a company, but you know it's ending this year and not getting renewed, you're going to want to look at that when evaluating a defense company. In addition, like when these companies, like one of the most important things is the people they have working for them and their like intellectual capabilities, I guess. So you can look at like how much they're earning per employee to kind of get a gauge for that. If they've got good people working for them, that's going to directly translate to the bottom line. We also have materials. I think we're running out of time here, but we've got one material company. It's called LyondellBasell. They're a chemicals company. We'll get to them in a bit, but we're like perfectly on weight. It makes up 2.5% of the S&P 500 index. That's what it represents in the SIP portfolio as well. They have not done quite as well as industrials in the past 5 years, but I think they're going to start to do well coming up here. Industrials tend to do well during the early part of the business cycle when things are ramping up economically. They kind of feel that they build common products that everybody needs to run their businesses, whereas materials tend to do better later on in the business cycle when other things start to back off. Materials, I think, tend to do well, so might be worth looking at. I think when things start to slow down a bit here coming up, they might do well here in the short-term future, I think. Materials is much smaller and less broad than industrials was, but there's 5 industries in it: chemicals, construction materials, containers and packaging, metals and mining, and paper and forest products. They're pretty self-explanatory. Chemicals or chemical companies, etc. We have LyondellBasell and the chemical company. They make polyethylene and polypropylene, among other things. Those are like their 2 biggest products. Like polypropylene, I think it's used. It's a plastic fiber that gets used in long johns and some other things. You make textiles out of it, bottles, I believe. Like anything you can think of plastic. Like a lot of it comes from these 2 materials. They do other materials as well, but those are the 2 ones that they're really prominent in. I think the the largest for one of them and the second largest manufacturer in the world.
For the other one.
Yes.
That's was the second sheet we'll give you guys.
You want to go over this?
They're a Dutch company. They're actually relatively new. They're about 9 years old. They're the second largest producer of polypropylene in the world. Polypropylene is also used to make essentially car hoses and industrial connectors. So it's got a lot of industrial uses. Pretty much all the tubing in cars, engines, things of that nature, made of polypropylene. They make plastics and consumer goods. According to the tin can, the vast majority of it is used in the automotive sector. So they have a refinery based in Houston. They had some issues with the hurricane recently. Around 80% of their property, plant, equipment style, their refinery, most of their big materials is based in the U.S., mostly in Texas. They do have some stuff in Michigan, which I thought was odd. So it was some R&D stuff. In Europe, mainly Germany. They do have some stuff in France and a little bit in Spain. They didn't say what it was though. And the rest is spread out across the world in the Philippines, China, really random places as executive offices, research facility, and sales offices. London had a big executive office, I remember, and it will. Yeah, we expect it to be highly profitable, especially, as Ryan said, as we approach the end of this particular economic cycle. And people's cars are going to keep breaking down no matter what.
We actually did do an industry analysis for the plastic industry, or the best we could, but I think we're out of time, gone over our time budget,
Yeah.
so, yeah. That's all we've got there. Any questions?
So does ExxonMobil, that's one of the biggest competitors, they make
Yeah.
polypropylene also?
Yeah, yep. With their refineries, I think that's